So a couple of comments just to and then about this scale or this screening tool is it's also been known that kids that have one exposure and one behavior have trauma symptoms. And having all of, so I don't want you to, this isn't meant to label or diagnose. It's meant to screen for further assessment, okay? So I wanted to make sure that you understood that cautionary note. I'm going to move in and talk next about, so for kids that have experienced trauma, what that experience is like for them and what it might mean for your schools and your teaching, okay? So the symptoms, for those kids that fall into that category of having symptoms that have the exposures and the behaviors, one other comment about behaviors. The kids that we need to be really mindful of is there's a number of kids that experience trauma that don't have externalized behaviors, they have internalized behaviors. Those are the ones that might have suicidal or self-harm behavior where we don't see it and it's a surprise to us because they aren't acting out. And they're maybe shy and reserved in school, you're not hearing a lot, and then you discover that there's more to it. That challenge is the kids that are getting, it's the squeaky wheel that gets the grease. So there's a number of kids that have their trauma experiences shuts them down and turns them inward instead of acting out in the world. So you have to be aware of that group. Let me talk to you about what the post-traumatic stress reactions are. Notice I didn't say this is PTSD or this is anxiety disorder or depression. Actually, from my perspective as a therapist and clinician that specializes in trauma, I don't like those diagnoses, partially because most of those diagnoses were adopted from adult diagnoses and applied to kids, and those diagnoses are not all trauma informed. So there's a lot of kids that have had a lot of trauma. When I worked at St. Vincent Home, the kind of diagnoses that a kid that was in the home there, and remember to get in the children's home, it meant they were having a hard time living in a family. Here are the diagnoses they had, and Mark might remember some of this and want to add to it. They were diagnosed as having PTSD, major depression, bipolar, anxiety disorder, ADHD, other learning disorders unspecified, conduct disorder, oppositional defiant disorder, and that's just the first kid. Because what happens with the diagnoses, a lot of them just, they kind of get layered on, and what we need to do to help kids heal and grow is understand their symptoms. Because diagnoses are labels, whether we're adults or kids. Yeah, you want to?
Well, what also got layered on was their meds.
Yeah.
We have 2 or 3 different medications to treat those
yeah.
diagnoses.
Well, and having worked with I've worked with a couple of the best psychiatrists in this community, child psychiatrists, and I just know from the way they monitor and pay for things that you don't give a child a medication that doesn't have a diagnosis that goes along with it. So sometimes they'd try a med because the kid was behaviorally out of control and not safe, and they'd add a diagnosis to it. So I want to encourage you, be careful, even if you get kids that have multiple diagnoses that come into your schools and you become aware of that. That is not, don't determine how you help them by understanding their diagnosis. You want to understand their behavioral, how it shows up behaviorally and symptomatically. There's a big move right now that is really, it's actually been going on for a while, but there's a real look at the overuse of medications with kids and probably with adults too. My dad is geriatric and ill, and he just moved from Traverse City and is living with me, and we stabilized him after taking him off of 5 psychoactive medications, okay? And he was getting what he felt and we felt was good medical care. But he had multiple providers. I got him to my house and I looked at what was on and I think, we got to do something about it. Same thing can happen with kids, especially kids that are served in the child welfare and mental health system. I am not anti-medication. Medications really do help kids. but the diagnoses are a challenge. The other thing with trauma diagnoses for kids is the diagnostic manual that psychiatry and other mental health professionals use, which is called the DSM-5, uses PTSD as the trauma diagnosis. That was developed, it grew out of shell shock in the Vietnam War and around the symptoms that adult combat or veterans were showing, okay? And they're not developmentally informed. So the criteria to meet a PTSD diagnosis, kids actually can, you can do an assessment and see all kinds of things and know what's happened to them and understand these kinds of things, but they don't meet the criteria for the diagnosis because the diagnosis is not developmentally informed. But, so I'm not anti-diagnosis, I'm not anti-medication, I am anti-labeling. And we have to understand if a kid is showing a behavior that's of concern, what's the function of that behavior? That's our question. Where's that coming from? What it's coming from? Not whose fault is it, what's wrong with them, but why did that happen? So let me tell you a little bit about kids' stress reactions. The first is they re-experience the event. So re-experiencing a traumatic event can look like a lot of things. It can be what we would hear as a flashback, you know, that they have something in their environment triggers them and they are taken right back to the moment of fear, the moment that they were in danger. And it can be as vivid as a flashback. It can also be when things happen to kids early in their lives before their language is fully developed, their memories aren't filed in a logical language-based way. They're filed in their sensory system. So for some kids that have had things happen to them early in life or even in utero, what can happen is there's some kind of sensory experience that's a trigger. And it just triggers dysregulated behavior. So that sensory experience can be any of the 5 senses. Smells are particularly strong for kids. If kids have some developmental issues early in life, how memories get tied together and things that happen to them later in life also don't always make sense in how we think of our memories are kind of linear, logical file cabinets. And the wiring for kids that have had bad things happen are all over the place. Okay, so what triggers their behavior is often a mystery, and the solution for them isn't always knowing what the trigger is. It's recognizing that something triggered them and helping them develop the skills to manage it. So they're re-experiencing the event. That can also be even in their perception of the event. So one of the things for kids that have experienced trauma is they've had this overwhelming fear, and when they experience that, that can then get transferred to someone else. So I can work with a kid, I can be a safe adult for a kid and say or do something that triggers them, and I have no idea what I did, and they have no idea what I did, but I triggered something. Somehow I connected into that fear. Here's the really interesting thing that, and I don't probably have enough background or knowledge, but that's important to understand is there's a whole field now called epigenetics. Epigenetics has determined that things that happened 3 generations ago in your family that were traumatic affect the biological, your stress reaction. They affect the way, they affect your genetics, and what it is they affect the environment that the DNA unfolds in, okay? So, when we talk about groups, if we talk about survivors of the Holocaust, American Indians, African Americans, we know that there is genetically an alter in the stress response. So intergenerational trauma is a biological thing that impacts them. It's a new field, and it explains a lot of things that Sigmund Freud used to say, that we were just working out our parent parenting issues and said a lot of things that if you look back at some of his theories that a lot of people don't necessarily ascribe to, but you look back at him and say, oh, he had a sense of that epigenetic thing, that what happened. I worked with a client once whose his mother, he was the youngest in a large Catholic family, and his mother was an immigrant to this country at the age of 17 and had spent some time in a concentration camp. And when he talked about the stress response for he and his siblings and the kinds of challenges they had, I'm pretty convinced that it was the playing out of her trauma for them. High rates of there was suicide in the family. There was high rates of substance use. She had an early adolescence had that exposure and never really got help for it and never talked about it because you don't talk about those things, Yeah.
Not to get off on a tangent, but do you know how they would distinguish between whether that traumatic stress response was handed down through genetics versus behavior?
Well, it's both. It's not either or, it's both. But it's always been thought that it's handed down behaviorally. What the field of epigenetics has said is that there is a biological mechanism that it's handed down. That isn't an exact answer to your question, but it is really kind of both. And what it tells us is this is pretty complicated stuff, but that we have to recognize where people come from and the collective experiences. Yeah?
I think sometimes in mental health we would see if a child was diagnosed at a young age with a pretty heavy diagnosis, like schizophrenia or something, that they would dig deeper into sort of the genetic piece of things more than they would like the millions of kids that are diagnosed with ADHD every day. Like if somebody had a significant diagnosis, I know that in mental health, when I worked in mental health, they would always dig deeper and say, well, was there a grandfather? Was there an aunt? Was this skipping a generation? Why is this happening with such early onset in this child? So I noticed that. I mean, I don't know much about that genetic stuff, but I did notice that they would sort of prick their ears up to that kind of stuff.
Well, partially because there is a genetic, for some diagnoses like schizophrenia and depression, there's some genetic, some proof that there's a genetic way that it's passed on. The interesting thing is, though, that I specialize in child trauma now. In the late 80s, my first job out of graduate school, I worked in a state hospital. I worked on the long-term unit. I worked with people that had psychosis and were on lots of medications and lots of symptoms. It was a great place to learn about behavior. What I know now looking back is some of those young adults that were really psychotic and had multiple diagnoses probably had pretty severe abuse and neglect as kids. That just, was that? So let's go back to this. So go ahead.
Adopted as an infant but came from a very traumatic biological situation,
Yeah.
Would that play into their epigenetic?
Yeah, so I'm gonna repeat the question because Peter wanted me to be sure to touch on this. So the question was, if you had a child that was adopted as an infant, would epigenetics be an issue? Actually, epigenetics in parent trauma is an issue. I have a nephew who was adopted who it was an open adoption, not a child welfare adoption. Open adoption means that the birth mother chose them out of a book to give her baby to. They were there when he was born. They know something about her background. He started to have trouble second and third grade with sensory processing. And then by puberty, really full-blown mental health issues. And what they know now and think now is that probably there was some fetal alcohol exposure. But she also knows that my sister-in-law and brother-in-law know that the birth mother was exposed to all kinds of trauma in her life. That's why she made the choice to give her baby up. So there's, the answer is yes. So we know that, but there are also, I don't want any of you to give you this information. I want to heighten your sensitivity to it and awareness, but I don't want us to label kids, because there are many children that are adopted from really traumatic experiences and they go on to thrive. There are also kids that are adopted and they have lots of challenges. Guess what? Just like the rest of the kids in your schools. It's just that adoption is a risk factor. And with adoption, depending on when someone was adopted, we're always looking at that really early childhood stuff that it impacts attachment and relationships. So I'm not suggesting they can attach, but I'm suggesting that if your early needs for caregiving were disrupted or not met consistently, you may have trouble with social relationships. So the one thing to know is that if a kid, and that can happen with adoption or other instances, and it's not just people that are in abuse and neglect. There are lots of things that impact early attachment and relationships. Parental illness is one. Parental loss can affect attachment. Stress of new parents, postpartum depression can affect some of that early attachment and mean that kids aren't securely attached, that they're more anxious about relationships. Sometimes it's other trauma and not care, in that their protective factor is their attachment, and there's other things that happen with trauma that cause challenges. So we see re-experiencing the event, avoidance. So one of the things that happens in someone's brain when they have a traumatic event is that you learn to turn it off. So kids that are, for instance, kids that are sexually abused, when they're exposed to someone who is sexually abusing them over time, they learn to shut it off and disconnect. So you'll hear survivors of sexual assault talk about having like what sounds like an out-of-body experience. I stepped away from it. It was like I was watching it and wasn't there, or I just disconnected. That is a survival mechanism. It's a survival mechanism in the moment, because how can you survive abuse again and again and again? Your brain naturally shuts it off and turns it off, okay? So it's adaptive in the moment, but if it becomes generalized to other areas or other stressors, it can lead to avoidant behavior. So when kids that have avoidance symptoms come into therapy, the experience with them is they're the ones just say, you're working, something awful has happened to them, and you ask them to talk about, that's no big deal, that didn't bother me. They just kind of shut it down. No problem here. Because what they're doing is protecting themselves, because if they don't necessarily have the skills to deal with the overwhelming emotion that would come from being fully present to what had happened to them. So avoidance becomes a symptom. It can be a conscious, no, I don't want to talk about it, no, I'm done with that. It can also, and often is not, a conscious process. They just divert. You bring up something that's difficult, they just stay away from it. They change the subject, they disconnect. On one end of the spectrum of those symptoms for trauma is kids that are, they disconnect, like disassociate. So they're not really conscious. They're just in another place. Kind of, when I say dissociative, if some of you know, maybe remember dissociative disorders from your psychology class, they talked about the people with multiple personalities and disconnect. I don't necessarily buy all that. I think that there are parts of them that disconnect. In some situations, that part of them kind of turns off and disconnects. Here's what's happening at the same time with all that avoidance and the triggering, re-experiencing. At the same time, these kids have incredible survival skills. So if you can think about understanding their behavior and how did it serve for them to survive, sometimes they've missed things developmentally, socially, cognitively, because they're avoiding or re-experiencing and shut down. But they've overdeveloped other coping skills. So some of these kids that know that bad thing that happened to me wasn't trauma and I don't need your therapy and there's nothing wrong with me, although you see some other behaviors that are of concern, they're also incredibly charming because they've learned that part, they've developed the ability to engage, and it's a survival mechanism. So we have re-experiencing avoidance. Hyperarousal is, this is the kid that is on alert all the time, constantly surveilling their environment, looking for signs of danger. So can you think of a time when you have been concerned and worried about something and hyperarousal is in place for you?
Like, after a mass shooting, when I'm sitting in a movie theater and somebody walks in with their hoodie up, that
Yeah.
kind of feeling that, like,
Yeah.
where's the exit?
So we are all, that is our exposure in our culture to these mass shootings cause some hyperarousal. And it's not just, in the movie, some people it overwhelms. Imagine what going to church in Central Texas is going to be like next Sunday. That's hyperarousal. So think about kids that have had traumatic experiences where hyperarousal was their survival mechanism, and it gets kind of attached to everything. So hyperarousal can also look very much like ADHD. It's this like inability to pay attention to anything and focus specifically on anything because I'm looking at everything all the time because I don't know what's safe and what's not. Okay? So hyperarousal looks like hyperactivity, it looks like overvigilance, it looks like a lot of those kinds of things. It can also be agitated behavior, irritable behavior. Sometimes it's not even hard, it's hard to tell how it's different than re-experiencing. Kids that have experienced trauma also have experienced persistent difficult thoughts and emotions. Part of what we know is a major symptom for kids that have experienced trauma is emotional regulation. They don't have those skills. They're dysregulated. So here's how it showed out. I'll use a kid in my family who had temper tantrum issues. Okay? Actually, I'm going to talk about a kid at St. Vincent, although they're very much the same. Temper issues. Okay? You could kind of see it building. He'd get like more and more agitated, and you're like, oh man, he's going to blow a fuse. And all of a sudden, bam, he is out of it. Major meltdown. Chairs turned over, ranting, raving, and there's no even communicating with him at that point because if you do anything, it escalates it more. Think about, a 2-year-old developmentally is learning to manage emotions. So that's the 2-year-old tantrum that shows up across the lifespan for people that have experienced trauma because of this hyperarousal and the difficulty managing overwhelming emotions. So this kid has the meltdown. Takes an hour for him to reconstitute, and in the end, we're going to have it be one of the kids when I was at St. Vincent. So our staff knew when they're really in it and they're not connected and they're ranting, you don't talk to them a lot, you decrease the stimuli, you diminish, you don't want to set them off more. So then they kind of have this chance to reconstitute and they're all back together. So we use our best teacher, youth minister, counselor, therapist, principal skills, right? And let's talk about your choices. What choices did you make? They review. What choices will you make next time? Well, next time, I'll ask for help and I'll use my words. That's the 2-year-old version, but think about, our version developmentally all the way up to young adults. We would have same message. So we think we've done really good because the kid is like, I'm sorry, I didn't want to do that, I hurt their feelings. And then, what do? We give them a new plan and we think we're really good. And then a couple days later, we see that behavior start again. We even remind them, remember, make good choices, you were going to make good choices. And guess what? They don't, they explode. And we go through the whole thing again. Only what happens over time with those kids when they don't have that ability to regulate, is they get the message that there's something wrong with me. I made bad choices. I'm not good. I'm not good enough. And then we have another risk factor for them, because self-esteem and self-appraisal is, there's just must be something wrong with me because I knew what the good choices were, but I didn't make them. In their brain, when they've experienced trauma, the neurocircuitry is such that when they're triggered and when something's going on to cause them that stress, it's like they flip their lid and they do not have access. The part of your brain that you make decisions and plan is this part of your brain. They don't have access to that. They're in their reptilian brain. Reptiles don't have language. So they are, in fight, flight, freeze mode. So they're not, using a lot of words at that point, but they can do it and they know how to do it. So partially what we do with kids is we become the one to help them regulate. So think about what you do with a 2-year-old. You start to notice when they're getting agitated. You might change their environment, or you might do something before they're out of control because you can't get them. Once they've had their meltdown in the middle of mire, you're not going to use words and get them to calm down and make better choices, right? So you're working to early intervene, and you're doing things, you're looking at how can you help them regulate? How can you make a connection? How can you get them out of the overstimulated environment, that kind of thing. I have a resource to show you in a bit that might help with that some. Yeah.
So are you saying that if there's consistent early intervention, that eventually they will learn the skills to self-regulate?
Well, I'm saying that every human being has the capacity to self-regulate. There's nothing that can happen early in life that prevents someone from not developing those skills. And that the goal is to do consistent intervention early or late to help people develop emotional regulation skills.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Kind of. I don't know if you answered the question.
So ask it again.
So are you saying that if we do early intervention, that is how we teach them to learn to self-regulate?
Yes.
Okay.
But I'm not saying with endorsing that is true, but it is not true that what I don't want you to walk away and hear is that kids that didn't have early intervention, that there's no hope for them.
No, I
But
understand.
that happens in my field, in child welfare. There's kids that get diagnosed, all those diagnoses and labels, and they get determined as there's a diagnosis out there called reactive attachment disorder that suggests that kids can't attach. And I would say as a trauma-informed therapist that there is no one that doesn't attach. They're just not good attachments. And there's no sense of felt safety. So they don't feel safe. So what you said is absolutely true, but the converse isn't true. And that's probably the revolutionary thing about being trauma-informed is we've gone from this medical model, here's what's wrong with you, here's your disease model, to it's about what happened to you, not what's wrong with you. So we need to recreate experiences that are healing for people. There was another question, right? Yeah.
I understand not talking to them afterward about, okay, we're going to help you make good choices and kind of flipping that to helping them, readjust as they go. Is it okay to tell them the plan? So when you exhibit these behaviors, I am going to blank, switch your environment.
Yes, because what you're doing is you're breaking it out, and you're also breaking it down and helping them practice skills early on. So one of the things that therapists do to help with emotional regulation is they're focusing on things that now trauma-informed schools are doing. They're focusing on, they teach deep breathing, progressive relaxation, guided imagery, because you're giving kids the ability. So part of what you're doing with kids that get way out of their zone and dysregulated is you're helping them develop awareness so that they can self-soothe and self-regulate. So the number one skill with that and it's with kids and it's with adults, is being aware of your breath and focusing on your breath. Sometimes it's getting them, there's a whole range of skills that therapists develop to help keep someone grounded so that they don't flip out and get in that place. So some of it is about a mind-body connection. So when you practice, and you can't wait to use deep breathing till you're really anxious or dysregulated. You got to practice it regularly so that it's a skill you can bring up, right? So a basketball player doesn't wait until the free throw at the end of the game to master their free throw skills. They're practicing all the time. So teaching kids things that self-regulate is a primary skill. And they have to have that ability. It's like a biological need, and they have to do that before they can get into talking about emotions, or they may have the ability to talk about it to really impact and change that. So therapists work primarily with that biological deep breathing. Yeah.
I don't know if you can answer this now or not, but some of kids that I've worked with in the past and currently, in the environment at school, they can hold it together.
Yeah.
And then their parents come to us and are concerned because they just melt when they get home because they have worked so hard all day to keep themselves under control and organized, but when they get home, they lose it. And sometimes I say, let them freak out, like they have held it together all day, and let them decompress. I don't know.
I can't speak to your school. I can speak in general that some of the things that's happened, at least in public schools, when we don't have recess and we don't have gym regularly, kids don't get to use their big major muscles. And one of the things that's really helpful for kids to integrate all of the stimuli is using their major muscles, using, running and jumping and those things, how you open the door for recess and they're out and they're all over. That helps them reconstitute and focus. There's a trauma-informed school that's actually every hour the kids have 10 minutes of using major muscle groups. And it's recognizing how important that is neurobiologically for them to maintain their attention. So, yeah.
So to summarize, were you saying that therapeutically it's not really effective to talk through a child what they're going to do next time when they start moving in a direction of a lack of control, versus talking with them about what you're going to do with them when things do unravel?
Well, I think it's kind of a little bit of both. I'm not suggesting that it's not helpful to work on problem solving and coping skills, but more importantly, be sure that you include exploring, like, when did you start feeling that way? What was going on? When did you first start to feel like, like observing, I noticed your teacher said you were just sitting at your desk doing your work, and then all of a sudden you started to move, you weren't doing your work. What was going on? Do you remember? And they might not even be able to tell you, but what you're doing is you're trying to help them with that sequencing of things so that they develop some awareness. So then they can, because your goal isn't always about what they're going to do when they're mad and temper tantruming. It's what you're going to do to prevent that from happening. Mark?
I think in that moment, if you have time, it is always a good idea to think about alternative replacement behaviors for the problem behavior. More healthier responses. Maybe the student has a pass to go get a drink of water, use the restroom, take something to the office, some other alternative so the escalating behavior doesn't get way up here, and you can anticipate and plan and think about, okay, so we have some ideas to do this instead of the major meltdown next time.
And the challenge with all of that is that you're making you're coming up with creative solutions and alternatives for kids that are acting out, and teachers And faculty don't always like that because taking something to the office or going to get a drink feel like a reward. But we get kids in really vicious cycles if we think everything that they need to do to self-regulate is a reward, because they will never get there. So the best example I can give that is that one thing that was helpful for kids when I worked at St. Vincent's that were really overstimulated, and this will tell you how old I am and how long ago it was, is we had Walkman. And putting the earphones on and listening to music was something that helped them with the internal regulation. But here's what happened. We made getting access to their Walkman, they had to have so many days of perfect behavior before they could get it. So what really is a coping tool gets seen as a reward. And we could spend the rest of the day identifying the kinds of ways when we're doing behavioral intervention with kids that we get into that. And a lot of what we have to examine is how we were parented, because many of us were parented and you earned your rights, and you earned rights and through responsibility. And the challenge is that kind of discipline for kids that have experienced trauma or other developmental delays doesn't necessarily work. What happens with those kids is they get in behavioral spirals, and they get that message that I'm bad and I can't do it, because it's a parenting model called Love and Logic. Works with kids that have good skills and are attached and understand logic. Trauma is not logical because trauma affects the part of your brain that is in fight, flight, freeze. You have to be able to access your prefrontal cortex in executive functioning to use logic. And you can't use logic when you're hyper aroused all the time. Does that make sense?